I've had the pleasure of meeting hundreds of data leaders over the last few years, and one of the topics which keeps coming up every single time is what's the ideal structure for your data team? It's one of those things which a data team either has to think through or is just thrust upon them by the wider organization. So in this episode, we're going to be looking at what is the ideal data structure. If you're new to our channel, this is More Than Numbers. It's a podcast for data teams who are trying to break out of the support function mode and become engines of growth their organization. I'm Ollie Hughes. I'm the co-founder of Count.co, which is a canvas-based BI tool, which takes data teams out of the dashboard factory and lets them become their organization's problem solvers. To help us think through this topic of data team structure, I'm really pleased to welcome Lydia Monnington. This episode. Lydia is the data science lead at Google DeepMind. Lydia's had an amazing, glittering career. She's run data teams at organizations large and small, such as Ocado, time at Meta, Stewart, and now at Google DeepMind. Lydia, thanks for joining us. How are you?
Thank you very much. I'm very good, thank you.
Cool. Well, to start off, I love asking everyone the same question as an icebreaker. And this question I want to ask you is, like, when did you know that you wanted to not just use data in your career, but actually be a data person? When did you first fall in love with the idea of data?
So, yeah, I think the first time I really enjoyed it, my first job out of uni, I joined Citigroup on their grad scheme. So Citigroup is an investment bank. And we were doing kind of credit research. So looking at businesses and deciding which ones we should invest in or our clients should invest in and giving recommendations. And one of the things I did as part of that was really understanding companies really deeply and like modeling them. So we wanted to look 5-10 years in the future and say, like, would they have a stable cash flow? Would they be able to pay back their debt? And one of the companies we looked at was a care home company called Care UK. And what was really interesting about that was building out, they had, I think, 7 or 8 care homes, different sizes, and they had 2 income streams. Either they had beds that were dedicated to the local authorities, like the council would pay for it. Mm-hmm. And that was a guaranteed income stream that was paid whether there was someone there or not. But it was a little bit less profitable. Or it would be a private person, but obviously they would only pay if there was someone there. So there was an occupancy rate.
Yeah.
And so one of the things we were doing was modeling out, what that profitability looks like, what it looked like at different like demand for their services and different fullness of the care homes. And then we could then see, like, okay, in these scenarios, they'll be profitable, they'll be able to pay it back. These scenarios we won't. How likely do we think those are? So it really gave me a sense of like how data allows you to understand the world, but also how data can be used to answer really important business questions, to be used for business. So yeah.
I love it. I think that's so true. Care homes is just one of many things. I mean, I remember when I was similarly in my early career, I got incredibly deep into the idea of problem solving, how to make strawberry punnets in supermarkets, and got really into the detail of that. It kind of doesn't matter. Just problem solving with data is just a joy, regardless of the medium. Sometimes it's just the pure problem that you get from it. It's cool. That's a good answer. I love it. I want to move on. Let's talk about a bit more about where you are now, and before we dive into the content around team structures, maybe just tell us. Most people probably know what DeepMind is, but maybe you can give us a bit of an overview of where you are, the data team there. I'm sure there's lots of people thinking, what does it mean to do data in what is ultimately a data company? So tell us a bit more about DeepMind, maybe, and through the team.
So DeepMind, if anyone who doesn't know, our mission is to build intelligence to benefit humanity. So as part of that, DeepMind builds a large language model, so kind of a competitor to ChatGPT or Claude. It's called Gemini. But we also solve a number of other really, really interesting like problems that are really important to the world with data. So things like we've got a team who's trying to work on managing the plasma so that like fusion can work, because one of the big problems is like the plasma hits the edge of the fusion reactor and then you're not doing fusion anymore. We've got a team who's working on forecasting typhoons, so obviously people can get out of the way of those storms ahead of time and being more accurate, and so working with a number of weather services around the world, including like the US and Japanese ones. And obviously, as people have probably heard of, like AlphaFold, which DeepMind won the Nobel Prize for last year, which is very exciting. So yeah, that's DeepMind.
those are some big problems. I mean, we've gone from care homes and strawberry punnet to some of the biggest challenges in.
There is some really cool things. Yeah. It was one of the things that like I was really excited about when looking at joining, of like how many different really cool things are going on.
And so tell us more about and actually you're currently even hiring. So one thing we should shout out is actually you're currently looking for a few people to join the data team. So we'll share some in the show notes. You can find links to those job descriptions or point you if you don't already know about DeepMind's careers page. But Lydia, tell us more about like how does a data team fit? What is your team like? How do you work? Given that pretty much everyone in the organization is basically doing data of some description for very, very different reasons. So tell us more about your team.
Yeah, so we are quite a small team. We're about 15 people. We sit centrally, kind of, so we look across all of DeepMind. And we're not doing things like, what is the data to train Gemini, for example. We're doing things like how do we answer the most important questions for business? How do we make the most important decisions more effectively with data? So one example is like, how do we focus how do we look at what the teams can work on? How do we look at how we manage like compute most effectively across the org, things like that.
That's cool. That's a cool problem as well. That's awesome. So, I mean, you often ask people to tell us more about your data stack, just to help people. People love tools, but it sounds like, I imagine at Google, I think like based on all I've heard before, things like BigQuery span out as an internal tool. Probably you're using a lot of very weird and wonderful tools that aren't available to the public.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I'd call them weird particularly.
Okay.
It's like they are almost everything is an internal. Actually, I think everything is an internal specific tool.
Right.
But they in large fill the niches that you would expect other tools to fill. So we have a tool to do pipelining, we have a tool or data transformation, we have a tool to do orchestration, we have a query tool that's pretty good. We have a dashboarding tool, things like that. So there's nothing in that sense out of the ordinary, but it's built internally.
Got you. Obviously, you've worked in places before like Stewart and Ocado, where maybe that's more standard kind of, well, what's the word? Sort of external tooling that you brought in. Maybe the question I'd love to ask you, given you worked in both places, is like, obviously you're using proprietary tooling, but can you give a sense of like people can often have a kind of idealized view of big tech and think big tech's solved everything, but maybe you can be honest and tell us that if you still have the similar kind of problems you've seen elsewhere, even in Google.
Yeah, and I'd also talk about Meta as well when thinking about this, because people often come to me and say, the data must be perfect. I think there's a few things that I found that were really great and kind of show like the value of the tooling or how that's been thought about. So one example I found in previous jobs before working at Facebook, I found like if we wanted to log a new piece of data, like we need to do analysis, we need this piece of data. I once had an engineering team tell me it would take 6 months. And then I got to Facebook and I'd be working with an engineer and we'd need a new thing logged, and partly it was we were working on the same team, which I think makes that a lot easier.
Yeah.
But we would, it was literally one line of code for them. It would send it to somewhere that I could access it. It was all done. Literally, it could be done in 10 minutes kind of thing. And that was a really big game changer.
So velocity is a big difference.
The velocity and just the ease. So like the tooling had to be built out to just make that work.
Yeah.
But I think the flip side of that, which is maybe obvious if you're thinking about it, is the sheer quantity of data was incredibly large. And so one of the big problems we had was, people are logging things everywhere. You can create your own thing. So how do you know what is, the source of truth for a particular thing? So we then, some really good data engineering teams then did the sort of a gold or a validated data sets owned by a data engineering team. This is like, if you want data about people or you want data about ads, this is the source of truth place to start from, because otherwise, you're searching through 1,000 tables that have almost identical data. So the scale problem is definitely there. And so you're almost building things on top to fix that. Yeah.
Well, it says also it's a problem which every organization is suffering with, like the single source of truth. How do I understand the human involvement, people doing things with that, and communication? Those sound like familiar problems to every single data team
100%.
going. That's awesome. Well, look, thank you. That's a really helpful background. What you're doing sounds so interesting. But we're going to switch now to talk about something which I know is dear to your heart and you've spoken about before, which is like the data team structure. As I said at the beginning, this is a thing which everyone has to think about if you're in data. Everyone is either going to be thinking about what's the ideal structure, or wishing they were a different team structure, or they'll be told by people up high that there's now a new team structure they've got to start managing within. It's not always a thing they have everyone has full control over. And it's one of those things, if we think about the tenets of like data teams, it's one of those things which is a real enabler, like, operational clarity, problem solving, time to decision, the ability to measure yourself. These are things which are fundamentally that we talk about many times on our show. And these are always the case, but often the enabler of all of these four things is getting the right team structure to have the right kind of conversations and make collaboration just generally easier. So I want to tee you up for this and just ask you to just talk us through the different types of team structures. Like, how does it generally evolve? And we can then talk through the pros and cons. And hopefully, as we talk through it, people can help us. We can help people think about what's right for them and whether it is actually one perfect answer. So maybe let's start off with, where do people usually start? And what are
so most companies usually start with a centralized data team. The reason for this is kind of obvious. If you've only got 2 data people, you're probably going to put them together.
Rather like opposing forces that
like
the team.
Well, and also, like, I think if you're separated in that kind of situation, and why one team is valuable is you get to share a lot of knowledge, you get to build out best practices. If you have ways of working that are more efficient, you can build out data foundations that are shared across the org. Let's say you had someone in sales team and someone in operations team, they might build out completely different sets of revenue data which don't align. So having one team is really good for that. It also means everyone's reporting into an analytics leader, so you get things like your manager can help you progress. They actually know what you're doing, so you're not having a manager who kind of doesn't actually understand the depth of your work. So they can help you progress and grow and do training and all of those things. You could be coached by other analytics peers. All of those things are super good in this scenario.
Yeah. But where does it start to fall down then?
So the thing that tends to happen is you have a small team and more requests come in, and you're trying to manage that workload. And often if you're sat centrally, you don't have that depth of relationships with the people you're working with. So, you maybe will only chat to someone from finance a couple of times a month, and you're not like part of that team, or someone from ops. And so what that means is they'll be asking you something, and they'll say, okay, I need this piece of data, and you'll give them that piece of data, but you don't know what they're going to use it for. You don't know why they care about it. So you're kind of like a data factory or data treadmill.
We don't like that.
And there's 2 kind of costs to that. One is you're producing stuff that might not answer what they actually need. You're just kind of turning out data. You're not actually being a true partner to them. And the second is you can't prioritize effectively because you don't know what it's being used for. You don't know why it matters. So how do you make the right choice about where do I spend time, or which one do I prioritize? And it ends up with this very bureaucratic process where you're having to kind of litigate between different parts of the org to say, like, this is higher priority than this, and this is why, or this is our backlog, and we need to have some way of managing that. And so it becomes, you're kind of like devalued, but also like people are in a very bureaucratic process, and that's not very effective for anyone.
Yeah, you're basically you're being distilled down to the most fundamental thing you can do, which is give them data rather than actually the higher value functions that you could be doing with them, and leaning in more and being more useful in that area.
Yeah.
And when does this? I guess this can happen pretty quickly. Like, I know there's the bravest role I think in Techland is the solo data person, the first data hire in a startup who's got to build the stack and sell the business. That is the place that the people go to cut their teeth. I know many people who've been through that journey and done that before. The second person who brings in is like the savior of that person and starts to give breathing room. And so at what point does this become like, do you start to, is it really start to become even practical thing about doing anything else, like to have a different structure at all?
I think that's an interesting question. I think it's, at the point where you've got enough that you could have a team in each area. So let's say you had finance, ops, and sales. If you had, say, 12 people, so you've got a manager and 2 or 3 reports each, I think that would then be very feasible. I think it's also at the point where you start to feel these issues happening and this lack of connection is when often companies start swinging the other way. And so
And
you
what's
kind of go,
so then you can swing, and you can swing a long way.
yeah, if you
Or more
swing to the
broadly,
other extreme,
yeah, let's go there.
and this often happens actually almost unintentionally. So let's say you've got this bureaucratic process we were talking about, people have to wait maybe 4 or 5 months to get something they need. And some teams like, actually, I really need some data stuff to do my job for my team to be effective. I'm just going to hire someone in my team. And this is sometimes called a shadow data team.
Yes.
And so either these can be a few people or this can be the whole data team. And in this case, you are reporting into the area there. So from into the sales lead or into the ops lead. And what's nice about this structure is you are part of these teams. You know, you'll go to their team meetings, you'll understand what their goals are, what's really important to them. You'll have a real deep knowledge of the team and how they add value and where you can add the most value. And the ideal of this is then you are going in and you're like, okay, I know what's really important to the sales team. I know how I'm going to solve their problems, and I'm going to, proactively solve that or work on that and deliver those results. And so that's the ideal of that.
Yeah, you've got the maximum domain knowledge. You're shoulder to shoulder with people that you can really work on. You're able to have more autonomy, maybe more agency to do what actually matters because you're part of the team, and a good idea is therefore accepted. You've got the maximum trust. Yeah.
Yes. The way things can go wrong here, the first is you're kind of the opposite of the previous case. You're reporting in someone who doesn't understand analytics. So, they might ask you for something and not really understanding how long it takes. You won't get that development. Mm-hmm. The other thing that can happen is, ideally, you're kind of a true partner in this scenario, but often, you're still just pulling data because they're just like, oh, that's the data person in the team, kind of. You're not really respected necessarily. And the bigger, like, insidious issue that's kind of a longer term one is that people start building out their own separate data stacks. And so you start getting inconsistent answers between different departments, wrong answers when you try to like tally things across. That's a lot of duplicated work. You've got a lot of inconsistency, and that causes a big problem for the business. It also means
shadow BI tools, like shadow data teams. You just have the shadow data stacks appearing.
Yes, data stacks appearing everywhere, inconsistent. Yeah. So a lot of duplicated work, and like duplicated process. And maybe, sometimes I've seen different companies have different stacks even. Like, one will be using DBT, one will be using Snowflake. So it's completely separate.
Yeah. That's where you want. That's when it gets really hard to fix as well. So you want to try and capture that. So
try and solve it ahead of time. Yeah.
Try and solve it ahead of time, or unpick it. I know that's something which when we were speaking in an interview recently in a previous episode with Lena from Bumble, she was talking about the kind of one of the big jobs of coming into a new role and getting started is just like that. This survey of like where are all the data people, where are all the data tools, that kind of surveying the landscape to work out what is the structure that's implicitly built up and often hasn't been thought through, and you've got to fix that as one of your first things to do in that first year as a data leader. So yeah, it's a kind of thing you might even just be presented this problem to solve.
Yeah, exactly.
So like bold push, then people will probably be mostly in one of those two extremes, the centralized or the embedded extreme, which is the other swing that we've been talking about. Like, do you want to put forward a bet for the ideal structure then?
So the one I've found most effective is kind of what's called a matrix or a hybrid team structure.
Yeah.
And the idea behind this is you're trying to get the best of both worlds, but to make it work requires more than anything quite a lot of trust, actually. The reason it requires trust is if you're in an embedded model, you're taking the people out of those teams. They're not in the direct reporting lines of those orgs anymore. Yeah. But they are still, in a sense, dedicated to them. So that's why I've kind of put the data team like still close to those orgs. Yeah. And the idea there is you still get the knowledge of what's important, you still get the relationships, you still feel like part of the team. Mm-hmm. And thus you get the ability to build the most important things, answer the most important questions. But you're actually in a central data team. And that gives you a number of things. The one thing it gives you is a level of independence. So if you're embedded and you're, say, reporting into the head of sales, it's very difficult to say, hey, I think our sales strategy is wrong. And actually that's something where analytics teams could actually add a lot of value, like being a real independent voice for the org. Yeah. And so if you're sat like this and you report into a data leader, you're able to do that, but hopefully also your relationships are such that you can, say that and have that land in an effective
Well, actually,
way.
even have an opinion to know that's the case, right? You've got
Yep.
best of. I understand
Yes.
really what's going on. I know, and I've got the backing of another department to come in with this kind of view. Yeah.
And obviously the other benefits you get of reporting into a data leader of your progression, your growth, standardization across the org of both tooling and process, using centralized tools are all there by virtue of having this structure. It is a little bit more complicated, like both organizationally and partnering, because you effectively have all the data team people are effectively in two teams. And so like relationship wise, that's more complicated. It takes a little bit more time, but actually when that works and when you've got that trust and that expectation that data is an independent voice, that's a very powerful structure.
And it makes a lot of sense. And that the comparisons you're playing about the pros and cons of the centralized and then fully embedded model, it does naturally sound like the right mix of both the pros and the cons. I wonder if you just unpack this a bit more. I guess the question that a lot of people will be thinking about is, this is really helpful, but I'm not able to make this decision myself as a data leader or as a team. How can someone make the case for this without getting to the politics of people thinking their headcount's being taken away? Like, have you seen that? Is there different versions of hybrid basically where some people, the payroll sits in the different departments versus the data team? The practicalities of it are quite tricky, and I guess similarly how you introduce it as a suggested structure.
Yeah, I think this can be, if you're not in this structure, it can definitely be difficult to get there. So there's some things you can do which sort of start to get there without going all the way. The most common one, I think, if you're in a kind of embedded style model, is having some sort of like data community. So that is,
yes,
the data teams meet every month, they share best practice, they start to build relationships, even if it's not the reporting line. If the teams are like building really strong bonds between them, you can start to get some of those benefits without going all the way.
That's really helpful. That's like, so rather that you can, the data people can just form that community of best practice together and get a lot of the benefits without necessarily being formalized. That's a really good idea. Yeah.
And if you are a data leader in a team that looks like this, I would strongly recommend that. Like, one of some of the most like rewarding and excellent experiences I've had is like relationships is with data leaders from other like teams, like where we understand each other's problems. You start to think about best practice and training, and it's been, I had that. Ocado had sort of a number of data teams. We had amazing, some of our data science team leaders like did training sessions for everyone on kind of precision and recall, and that was really useful for the whole org. Partnering with teams across Stewart was similar, like finding problems, working out what we could solve as a group. Really can be really beneficial. And then if you do from either side, if you're trying to switch in from embedded, I think it is that, how do you build that trust with teams that they will get the support they need, even if then they don't own the reporting line? And trust is one of those things that it takes time, and you have to kind of show good intent and keep working. And I think some of it is, if you've got a couple of people who are centralized and a couple of people kind of still embedded, can you show that the people who are centralized are giving them the support they need? If you're coming from centralized, the problem is actually, how do you change how teams see the data team? Like, how do you make them feel like these people are part of your team rather than part of a central data team? And that's actually on both sides, both on the teams you're trying to embed in, and how does your team feel? Because if they're used to being, we get a task, we do it, actually sitting as part of a team is quite a different model. So there's actually a coaching part for your analysts as well.
Is there any sort of advice you give for someone going from centralized, trying to make it more matrix? Because I think you give a great, very practical, very relatively easy thing of like into your best practice to go embedded to hybrid. But what about central? Is it like actually going with your desk to be close? If you're in an office, go sit next to that team. Is there some of those really like very basic but very helpful levers that you can take to just be available? Go to the team meetings, maybe. Is that it's like
going to the team meetings as a data leader? I've often said like, hey, can you add Sally into your team meeting from now on, because I'd love for her to feel more part of the team. Some of it is like literally just sitting down with those leaders and saying like, this is what I'm trying to do. What can we do so that people in my team feel like part of your team? like what are the team meetings, what are the offsites they do, getting those involved to start that relationship.
That's really helpful. That's really practical as well. That's really great. Thanks for talking us through that. I actually, as you know, we often have a kind of anonymous data question from the More Numbers community, which you can join the More Numbers community by going to account.co/MTN. You can find links to other episodes and also join our kind of our vetted community of data leaders. One of the things that I got a question from, I think I teed this up to you before because we actually asked about it earlier this week when we had dinner, was how does this kind of structure work by discipline? So if you have a data science organization, data engineering, analysts, like does that change the answer of team structure when you have those specialisms within a data org?
Yeah, so I think about this. Some of it is like if you're thinking about data foundations, if you've got a team that's like data platform, sometimes this is called data engineering. So, those are the people managing your AWS instance, they're the people managing making sure Tableau works or making sure DBT is set up correctly. That team, I think there is value for it sitting centrally, because for them to be successful, they have to understand what the analysts and data engineers or data analytics engineers are doing, but they don't have to understand, Sally is trying to do this problem for finance day, Bob's trying to do this problem for sales day. So that being central, I think almost always makes sense.
Yeah.
Data engineering or analytics engineering, so which I would define as the people who are working to build, process data, build data pipelines, think about how we do that most effectively. That you can argue either way, and it depends a little bit both on how many data engineers you have.
Yeah.
Often companies don't really have enough, in my experience. I'm a big fan of if you have data engineers, they make all your data scientists and data analysts much more effective. So you have quite a lot of them, but a lot of companies have maybe 10 or 20 data scientists and data analytics and data analysts, but maybe only like 2 or 3 data engineers. And I feel like,
that's
my
that ratio, isn't there? I think about
there's some good blogs, like something in the order of 3-to-1. So for every 3 or for every 2 data scientists, you have 1 data engineer. I found it very good. But it also depends where you want to draw the line between the 2 roles. If you have a really small team, I'd probably have them really focused on what are the absolute essentials we need to have. So what is our most essential raw data? So that might be your sales data. Yeah. How do we process that into a really easy to use form? Maybe how do we do the cleaning of that? Maybe some of the metrics on that. Yeah. Because that's almost like your foundation for everything else. But then if you've got enough that you can then say this person is going to build a really great data stack for the sales team, then you can start embedding them as well.
Yeah. There's a helpful rule of thumb there I think you mentioned, which is when the decentralized sort of embedded decision is based on, firstly, how ubiquitous is the task they're doing. If they're managing a platform which everyone's going to touch, that's a more central role. And then the second lever is if you only have a few people, they kind of need to be centralized. But if you have a certain number of them, enough that you can start to lean more in and specialize their task, then embedded makes sense. It's kind of those are the 2 levers to think about, which I think is really a really good answer. Thank you. That's a good.
I'd also say, regardless of where they sit, the relationship between data science and data analysts and analytics engineers or data engineers is incredibly, that has to be really tight. That has to be really good, otherwise you're going to have a lot of problems. Talking about that understanding and that relationship is really key.
That makes sense. Awesome. Well, we've got a few minutes left, and I wanted to ask you the last question just as we wrap up, which is just, you've been through a lot of different companies. You've been big tech, smaller tech. I think you've been in government, you've been in investment banking. So I just would love, what is the one consistent thing that you found to be incredibly useful for wherever anyone else is in their career, wherever they're doing data? What is the one piece of advice that you have held on to or really found useful across all those different domains and organizations?
Yeah, so one of the things I found that was a really big game changer for me was focusing on why I'm doing things. I used to be, when I was at Ocado, I would get a really interesting problem and kind of follow every single rabbit hole and realize I was solving a bug that affected 2 users a year. Just because I was this doesn't seem quite right. Let's go and work out why. And that was really fun, but it was not incredibly effective. And so one of the really big things that changed for me was at the start of a project saying, like, actually, what am I trying to do here? What is the like outcome we're trying to achieve? What does success look like? And being really clear on that. Like, let's say we're trying to make a decision. Have I had the conversation with the stakeholder of like, okay, if I present you this, this, and this, will you be able to make the decision from that? Or actually, do you also need, you know, this extra piece? Or actually, could I only give you this first piece and that would be enough for you to make the call? And so just being really clear. You know, the other thing could be like, you know, the idea of hypothesis-driven analysis of like, what are the key hypotheses we have that we want to prove or disprove? Laying them all out first and really making, you know, thinking about what those are and how we make them. And then the final piece is obviously you know what you're producing, and then you can build a really clear analytics plan. Like, these are the tables I need out. This is probably how I need to write the queries or what stage I need to go through. And then at that stage, you start coding. And actually that means the thing I find is the thinking and the coding is actually quite difficult to do at the same time. But if you separate it, you can actually have a really clear time. You just, you know, plan everything and then you're just like, code, done, everyone's happy. And it also reduces the rework, because if you've had that conversation with someone saying like, okay, how are you going to make this decision? You know exactly what they need to see or not see, and you're not producing anything you don't need, and you're producing everything you do.
It's almost like you need a data white. Almost like you're pitching a data whiteboard here, by the way. Just by real coincidence.
I wonder who creates those.
You're just wonderfully pitching for a data whiteboard, Canvas-based BI tool. But but I'm joking. When jokes aside, that's an amazing piece of advice. I love the idea of just what you said there, a little nugget of like, when you go to a stakeholder and say, if I give you this, would you make a decision? I mean, even that alone is just such a powerful piece of advice.
It's a very powerful framing, actually.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you'll come to people and you'll say that and they'll be like, oh no, I just think this is interesting. And then you can be like, and I actually have had this conversation with someone once. It's like, I agree, it's really interesting, but I'm not being paid to do interesting things, sadly. I'm paid to like help make decisions that matter to the business.
And right now I'm paid to help you solve fusion and solve general purpose AI for the humanity. So I've got other things to do. That's great. I love that. Like always ask why is a really, really great piece of advice, and it just explodes with lots of different practical examples of it. That's wonderful. Lydia, we've run out of time. It's been an absolute joy to speak to you. Thank you for taking so much talking us through the different team structures, their pros and cons, the way to get the maximum amount of value from your data organization, and if you're fixed in a particular structure, and then talking about the purpose, the why. It's been a really, really great conversation. Just a reminder for those watching, if you want to look at more episodes or get into the show notes, come to account.close/MTN. Also, a quick plug, Google DeepMind are hiring right now in a few roles. Definitely check them out. You can imagine, I can't think of any more better data problems to solve than what Lydia's teed up at the start. So if you want to work with Lydia and join Google DeepMind, then you should check out their careers page. Now, Lydia, thank you so much. It's been an absolute joy. It's been really great.
Lovely to see you.
Speak soon. Bye.
Speak soon.